and we'll start with Jake. I'm going to tell you the order we're going to go in. So Jake, you'll be first, then Heather, then Gary, then Christine, then Louis Marcos, Chris Schlecht, and then Carrie and Eric, and then Tom. So Tom, right now you're bringing in the rear. Don't take too much time, guys. You have really interesting bios, and you are really interesting people. But let's just keep it pretty brief to maybe like 20 seconds each. Tell us who you are, where you work, what you do. Jake?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Jake Tawney, and I'm fundamentally a husband and a father. And when I'm not doing that, I serve as the Chief Academic Officer for Great Hearts Academies.
Thank you, Jake. Heather?
Hi, I'm Heather Washburn. I'm Vice President of Academic Achievement and Accessibility for Great Hearts Academies. Prior experience, I will say that I was a homeschool mom for a number of years and then was a teacher with Great Hearts and a school leader. So excited to be here tonight.
Welcome, Heather. It's great to have you. Christine?
Hello. Our children were educated classically, and I participated in that significantly. And I've taught at Messiah University for about 25 years, literature and poetry in particular.
Thank you, Christine. Louis? Oh, you're muted, Louis.
I just joined because I realized we have no school today. My name is Lou Marcos. I'm a professor in English and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University, and I do a lot of writing and speaking about classical Christian education.
You sure do. Gary?
Hi, I'm a colleague with Lou Marcos at HCU, and also live in Houston, where currently enduring a freak snowstorm. So it's been quite a few days.
Well, maybe we can send a few snow plows from Pennsylvania your way. I don't think you have many.
No.
Chris Schlecht?
Hello, I have been involved in classical Christian education now for well over 30 years. My home institution is New St. Andrews College, where I teach a variety of courses. I am the head of humanities. I direct a graduate program in classical Christian studies. But I suspect the real reason why I'm here, like Louis Marcos, is because I'm so downright telegenic. I just come off so well on camera. So Louis and I, that's why we're here, is the eye candy.
Let's zoom in on Chris, shall we? Thank you, Chris. Carrie?
No, I'm the eye candy. I'm so sorry. My name is Carrie Even, and I am from Siloam Springs, Arkansas. I've been involved in classical education for over 25 years, first as a teacher and then as a homeschool mom for 12 years. I'm now a classical education consultant. Started a classical Christian school here 6 years ago in Siloam Springs, Arkansas, and I currently adjunct at John Brown University in Integrated Humanities.
Thank you, Carrie. Eric?
Hey guys, Eric Cook, president with the Society for Classical Learning. Do a bunch of other stuff, but that's my thing that keeps me primarily occupied.
Thank you for being with us, Eric. And Tom?
Hey everybody, I'm Tom Dobler. I am the National Director of Exceptional Student Services for Great Hearts Academies. I've spent 20 years as a special education teacher, and for almost 18 of them now, I've been with Great Hearts as a special education teacher, then a leader at the regional level, and now national level. Just thinking about this question in that context. So thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. So I had an opening question prepared. I'm going to go with it. I wanted Martin to respond to it as well as Chris Schlecht and perhaps Tom. But the question is related to something Chris says in his essay. He says that how we answer this question of who's really qualified or can benefit from a classical education relates to one of the other questions we already discussed, which is what is classical education? And Tom touches on this, and so does Martin. Martin asks, well, maybe is that, oh, great. Here's Martin, so now I have to repeat the question again. if he comes in. Welcome, Martin Cawthron. Could you take 15 seconds and tell the audience who you are and what you do?
I'm Martin Cawthron. I am currently provost of Memoria College. I'm the editor of the Classical Teacher magazine and co-founder of Memoria Press.
Thank you, Martin. It's great to have you, as always. So just giving my opening question, it involves you as well as Tom and Chris and their essays, because all of you in your essays address this question of who would benefit from a classical education or qualify for it by relating it to a prior question, which is, what is classical education? So, Chris, you did that. Could you tell us why and why the definition of classical education is relevant to this course?
Yeah, if a classical education is a program that aims to cultivate an array of virtues in an individual, and these virtues are really human excellencies, then anyone who's a human being can benefit from a classical education, if that's how you define it. But if we were to put it in another way, should everyone be put through a program where they're reading Plato's Republic in Greek? I would answer no. So in a program that optimizes their virtues as a human being, everybody should go through a regime like that. If that regime involves reading Plato in Greek, I don't think that's for everybody. And so really depends on how you define it then.
Martin, would you chime in? And then Tom, would you follow Martin? And then we'll just let it take off from here. Martin, why do you think the definition of classical education is relevant to a question of who would benefit from it?
Well, I think this may be part of what Chris was saying. You know, there's two purposes to classical education. There's the overall cultural purpose of passing on a civilization, mainly the civilization of the Christian West. And then there's the individual purpose of helping to fashion every human being into a more full human being. So if classical education, at least in part, developing people into better human beings, then that pretty much qualifies, that everyone pretty much qualifies for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would say my thoughts are similar. It's interesting. I was thinking about how I define classical education and how different ways in which classical education can be defined. I think the way that Chris put it is it can be defined by what you study or what kids engage in, or it can be defined by its purpose. And I've always defined it by its purpose because in my experience working in classical schools for so many years, all of our choices about what we do, about the different ways in which we teach our kids, right, the pedagogy we use, so many of the right, the arguments over which book is better, those arguments are had in the context of the purpose of classical education, which, you know, has already been said by Chris and Martin. And so that's why, to me, it was really central to answering the question of whether or not classical education is for everybody, because of that purpose. And at the lens through which I look at it, it really is a human purpose, right? And it's tied up in a notion of human dignity. And when I think about if human dignity is something that's inalienable, that's sacrosanct, then and a classical education's purpose is aimed at fulfilling a human's life, right? Then any human must benefit. So yeah, the purpose is really central. I think the purpose is the way to define as opposed to the syllabus, if that makes sense.
Well, Martin says that classical education is essentially, you could just define it as education. And who was going to argue? He opens his essay by saying, I don't think everybody qualifies for an education. So if classical education is just education, properly, however we define it, if we define education as for every human being, of course, then every human being needs it. But Alfred J. Nock, whom Tom, you make mention of, and even Jacques Barzun, and of course Plato, a number of you mentioned Plato, and Seeley especially, does not think that everyone is qualified for a certain kind of education that has been called classical. So please respond.
Well, if I could introduce, perhaps to complicate it further, to parse the question further, when you ask who benefits, I'm gesturing to something that Martin said here. Who benefits, we need to answer that in terms of, are we talking about who is fit for benefiting from being within the tutelage, or maybe a whole community that can benefit from one person who receives the education? I would suggest that, a student who receives a classical education has been inculcated in loving his neighbor. And so that person's neighbor benefits from his classical education, regardless of what education the neighbor received. So when the question is framed as who benefits, classical education also can be the water in the harbor that raises all the boats, if you will.
Good. I think that's a legitimate distinction to be made. But let's go to this distinction of whether or not in a given community that you're referring to, Chris, everyone really is even qualified to get the education. And Thomas Jefferson, Alfred J. Nock, Barzun, Plato would say some people just don't have the capacity, the temperament, some kinds of prerequisites. And so many of you said there are prerequisites that need to be in place for a certain kind of classical liberal arts education to be obtained. And those prerequisites differ. So let's hear about them.
Yeah, I think it's pretty important for us to be thinking about our culture. Most people mention that in their essays, and be thinking about, in particular, what does this mean and who are we? So one of the distinctions that I introduced in my essay was that between intellectus and ratio. And I think that one of the things that interests me about thinking about intellectus is just that pretty much elementary education, that's what it is, right? It's that receptive gazing and receiving, looking, learning to attend. And another, so I think that most people who get that, who have the capacity for that, for attention as a prerequisite, can receive at least this kind of education, at least this aspect of grade school education. I want to introduce kind of another controversial idea, which is that I think, in a lot of the essays and a lot of the writings, we're always thinking about the barriers being, kind of sociodemographics and socioeconomics. And I think that actually wealth is probably one of the biggest demographics that is an obstacle right now to the kind of intellectus that I'm talking about. I think that increasingly it's very difficult. Many people talked about parents, but it's very difficult for students to be in homes where people can pay attention. And surprisingly, it's not because they're poor. It's more often because they're wealthy. So I think it'd be interesting for us to talk about, well, what are the obstacles? What are the barriers to a classical education, particularly if we're thinking about K through 6 and the beginning, because we all kind of agree that you need a sort of beginning in order to go on beyond that.
Okay, I think we definitely should go there, but let's answer one other question first. Because I think we all agree on this call that there are certain kinds of foundations that you would want to be laid. You call them prerequisites if you want. Some preliminary experiences and dispositions, training at home or grade school education that would qualify you to go up the ladder, if you will, to get a more robust and deeper classical education, maybe even sometimes culminating in reading reading Plato and Greek. But I would think we would all agree that's a rung that would be far out there, and not everyone needs to get there. But there are many steps along the way that I think we would all agree is a part of a liberal or classical education, increasing freedom, increasing virtue, piety, and capacity. But there are things that need to be in place. And we need, I wish Andrew were here, because Andrew says not everybody should go very far on that ladder. And maybe some people shouldn't even start on that ladder because they're just not ready for it, and you're going to spoil them if you try. So speak to that, please.
Yeah. Okay. So, if you ask yourself, well, the education that was going on in the little school on the prairie, okay, this was something that presumably any child could have accomplished. And you ask yourself, well, is that classical education? And I think it is, again, with a small c, and e. That what was going on there was passing on of a civilization. Go back and look at all the old readers; they had all the same stories. They were, and all those stories were passing on the ideals and values of our civilization. Now, they didn't do Latin, but only because they couldn't. And so I would say that, if you're talking about a full-on classical education, then you're talking about learning Latin and hopefully first and Greek secondarily. But if you distinguish between the ends of an education and the means towards those ends, Latin and Greek were the means, okay? But if the end was passing on your civilization. And the best means to do that is through Latin and Greek, in addition to all the other stuff we would normally do. But some people can't do that. That doesn't mean it's not classical education. It just means it's not full classical education. And we have to be understanding that that's where other people would be.
I think it's important to make that distinction between ends and means, because I think they got a little bit intermingled in some of the essays. Because if you just separate them as cleanly as you can, first of all, and say, who is this for? And how do we even really say with some clarity who it is for and how we determine that? Who can engage in that, and at what capacity, and how far, and how difficult is it, and what demographic and what circumstantial things, and has it ever been done before? Those are things that are after the question, is it for everyone? And they're not unimportant, but if the first one is true, then that frames us in a certain way. Because if we're going to say, well, look, of course, some people don't have the capacity for, well, who determines who doesn't have the capacity for it? Who, in Knox's words, is uneducable? Who's going to tell us that they're never going to develop the capacities or the appetites or the habits or the affections for the kind of things that we would aspire for them to have? Who does that? I mean, I can see why in Plato's world that they did, and it's a different worldview. But if we say no, this, the things that we ultimately aiming at in a classical education, I would say in a classical Christian education, which is what I'm dedicated to, which is really the abiding principle in my mind. If we said, should everyone be sanctified? Can everyone be sanctified? We would say without exception, well, yes. In really wide varying degrees, but we wouldn't say, a Christian shouldn't be. But if a human being is fully human when they're wise and virtuous, then after that, we can argue and we can say, well, not this version of classical in the medieval period, not this version of classical, not this proficiency with classical languages, etc. But we wouldn't say, no, it's not for everyone. We just have to start thinking in degrees then. And I think it's important to at least separate those out initially.
Yeah, I think that in my mind, that might be the biggest difference between Knock and Barzoon and Adler and Van Doren is this, on the one hand, making a decision about who can access something after they've already decided what it is, versus making a decision about who is meant for something after they've decided its purpose. If you talk about classical education again as having a purpose towards human flourishing. And like Eric said, decide that's for everybody. Then the question of what it is in terms of what do we do with the children and what do we put in front of them can start to change. And I think that it opens up all kinds of possibilities without departing from the purpose or the notion of classical liberal arts education.
You know,
Yeah, I have to-
Aristotle.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, you know, Aristotle makes that distinction between a liberal arts education and a servile education. And of course, a liberal arts education is, say, for free citizens who have leisure. Well, we are a democracy of free citizens, and at least the vast majority of children have that leisure that they can go to school. And again, I agree with Martin, education, but I would just say classical education is a liberal arts education. As long as we understand that that's what's meant by a liberal arts education, then it is. It's not going to be Christian necessarily in the public sphere, but I've got a book coming out from InterVarsity Press in April, Passing the Torch, an Apology for Classical Christian Education. And of course, I have a chapter on John Dewey. And like all of us in this podcast, we would disagree with him on most things. But I had to at least give him some kudos because he's saying, look, we're in a democracy. We've got kids from other countries. Can we have an education that can appeal to all of them? Now, I think he got the answer wrong, but I think he got the question right. And that's why I think Mortimer Adler asked the same question in the Paideia proposal and tries to at least provide liberal arts a grounding in the great books, the great tradition that founded us, the idea of civic virtues. So we've got, again, an education that creates virtuous, morally self-regulating citizens. I think we do need that, and everybody can have it, but not necessarily on the college level, but at least on the younger level.
I agree. So I think it's a question too. If you look at the purpose of education is talking about the who, and the who and the why of education, and but then that's distinct from the how and the what. So how and what we do in order to, it can be differing in depending on where a child or a human's background, but why we educate, and why we have a liberal arts education, I think is the same, universally, as you just said, Louis, and, we want a liberal education, and as far as, that question is answered, but I think that the what and the how can, be different depending on, where a student is. We can offer a buffet, and, everyone's going to choose what they need and are going to digest things differently. Not everybody is going to eat the sushi. So
I also thought it was, completely agreed, and it was very powerful. Christine wrote that this doesn't mean we should all go to college. College is not the only place that one can become liberally educated. It's not the only method by which to produce a liberally educated citizen. I think there's more options than people imagine for helping a person come to know their culture, right? Have that cultural passed on to them, and as well, search and discover their own telos, which is ultimately the purpose.
So this brings us back to definitions again, because if you define it too restrictively, like Chris did, the beginning saying that maybe classical education should be learning how to read Plato and Greek, then you're disqualifying too many people by how you've defined it. Okay, let pause here for a moment. I just want to speak to the audience. You have questions, and I see there are already 4 questions put in the Q&A box. If you put a question in the Q&A box, you've got a good chance of us answering it, because we're going to go for about another 15 or 20 minutes, maybe all the way up to the top of the hour, and then we're going to turn it into Q&A. Like the last 30 minutes will be us responding to you, okay? So just know that if you want to engage the chat box, you can, and maybe some of the panelists will even engage you too. But the Q&A box is how you can get a question in front of us at about the top of the hour. So I want to make sure that I want to turn now to Gary and Heather and Jake, but I'm going to give them a prompt and see where they go with it. Under what circumstances then might we decline to enroll somebody in a classical program, a classical liberal arts program? Are there such circumstances where we would say this person does not have the prerequisites to be a part of our classical education program? Jake, Heather, or Gary, if you would take that question and take it where you will.
So I think when you ask that question, I mean, I am one of the things I do in my day job at the Honors College at HCU is handle sort of admissions and applications from students to our program. And I don't think I ever, or maybe I do, I don't know. But I try not to at least deny students admission sort of because of sort of who they are. It always has to be on the basis of what they've accomplished or failed to accomplish thus far in their life. So that's one thing. But really in that context, or in the context of any educational program, I think a big consideration is how is this going to affect the other students in the program, and perhaps even the teachers in the program. So if every sort of educational endeavor, or if it were possible to educate one-on-one, that would be a case where no, I think you just sort of interact with a student, start where they are, and try and move them as best you can towards where you think they ought to be. Now, in our usual modes of schooling, we're doing that in groups. And so I might deny a student admission to the group because I think, based on my judgment or assessment of what they've accomplished or done, maybe references or lack of references and recommendations up to that point, that they would have that they would make things more difficult for the group as a whole to progress in their education. But even that, I think, is a judgment call, right? Because some of the best lessons we learn in groups is how to work with and help others who are not at our level, right? Who are beneath us, who seem intent, for example, on sabotaging the efforts of the group towards making progress in learning. And then what do you do? I mean, at a certain point with any group or organization, you would say, well, no, sorry, you transgressed too much. You're done, and we're expelling you. So, but those I think are really kind of it's not so much about the innate ability or aptitude of a student or prospective student, as much as it is how are they going to fit with a group that is together or being assembled, and what effect are they going to have on that?
Thank you, Gary. Let's go to Heather or Jake. Responses, questions to what you're hearing, or would you like to answer that same question?
Well, I can answer the questions. Sometimes on hard questions, Chris, I just state things that are sort of obvious to me. One obvious prerequisite to me to enrolling a child is that they do have to want the education, right? Now, certainly, we were in charter schools, so we don't actually deny enrollment. But I would say, rather maybe just recouching the question, not in terms of a denial of enrollment, but at least in terms of so the model itself being accessible. I do think that the student has to have some desire for it in order for it to be effective. The challenge, though, that I think we're running into here is, of course, this question of definition. And I agree that we would not want to be so restrictive in our definition as to limit classical education to reading Plato and Greek. But I do fear sometimes that we actually become too loose in this definition. When we talk about ends and means, we say, look, classical education is really about the formation of the human soul. All of that, of course, is true. So I'm not, of course, not denying that. But teachers are distinct from pastors and parents, who are also charged with the formation of the soul. And I think one way in which teachers are different, or schools are different, is that what makes a school is the academics. It is in part the means, right? The thing that we're doing is the thing that's moving us towards that end. If we give up on questions or decisions about academics, curriculum, pedagogies, and merely state that a classical education is simply one that develops the virtues, I do think we risk a school ceasing to actually be a school and being something different, right? And I'm certainly not trying to compartmentalize here between pastors and parents and teachers, but I do think it's important to note that a school is by its nature is this academic, curricular, pedagogical endeavor that makes it different than the kind of virtue formation that might be found with a parent or might be found with a pastor. And so that's where this gets hard, right? Because of course, if classical education is merely the formation of the soul, merely the development of virtue, then of course it's for everybody, right? The question gets more difficult when we start to think about it in terms of the academic model. And I would just point to one more thing that I think makes this question hard, which is that we are looking at, I heard somebody say, I think it was either Christine or Carrie say, let's look at K5, right? So let's look at K2, let's look at K5. What about K8? What about K12? What about K16? What about all the way to a doctoral level, right? All of that can generally be considered, if done in the right way, something of classical education. I think sort of on its extremes at the doctoral level, people largely would agree that's probably not for everybody, right? I think you're getting a lot more agreement when you start to look at the K2 level. The challenge is, when does that transition? How does that transition? What does that look like? And I would operate, I think I heard Eric say this, just under this principle that, when in doubt, the operating principle has to be that the education that we're offering in our schools really is for everybody. When in doubt, you have to make that assertion. It's a little like Notre Dame being down by 3 scores to Ohio State. They have to operate under the principle that there is enough time for them to come back, even if that's going to be pretty challenging. Because I think if you don't, you're going to run into this danger of who decides, right? Who decides who this is for? And so I think the operating principle needs to be that it's for everybody.
I think it's a really good point.
I'd like to go ahead, Eric. I'm sorry.
I already spoke, Heather. Go ahead.
I'd like to highlight a couple of things that Jake said and also answer the question. I think when we think of classical education, we talk about soul formation, we talk about human flourishing. I think in a lot of ways what the model of classical education does, it teaches us how to be human. And as we engage in that humanity, we're engaging in discussions of literature, we're engaging in discussions of science and mathematics. All of those curricular elements help to allow us to understand what it means to be human. The other side pedagogically that I think is significant is that human community that we form within the classroom. We run classical schools that are charters that are large. We have large classes, 30 children in a classroom. Typically the 30 are with 2 teachers in the lower school, but we have 24 to 28 in our upper schools. What we ask the teacher to do, though, is to lead children in community to discover truth. And through that curriculum and through that discovery, they're engaging with something beautiful. They're engaging with other human beings. Related to the question, I have to go to the quote that Tom gave from Amy Richards. I think it's one of the most impactful quotes that we need to consider. When we exclude persons with disabilities from our learning communities, we offer a curriculum that implies that people with disabilities are a burden, a problem best left to experts to be solved elsewhere. Within our academies, we do have a view that children, even those with significant disabilities, still can be in community with others, and they still can gain from the richness of the curriculum. through the conversations, through the community they're experiencing that in. So when the question is asked who should be allowed in, or if there should be limits placed, I think that's a challenge to say that it's more concerning that how their students are experiencing the learning, how the teachers experiencing the learning. Isolating those children and setting them apart actually can inhibit the humanity of the other children in the classroom. I've been around education for 14 years in the public sphere and have seen so many children with significant disabilities engaging with their peers in the classroom, and there's something in the humanity of the child that's formed. So I don't want to downplay what Jake said about the curriculum. I do think the curriculum is key to the formation of the children and to education, right? Our role as educators and teachers. The curriculum cannot be set apart. I don't think we isolate the children from the curriculum. It's our responsibility, and Du Bois says this, to become more deft and effectual in how we ourselves are ensuring that they can have access to that curriculum.
That's really well said. And I think, you know, by saying it's for everyone doesn't, it could imply that you're inherently watering down the meaning, the content, the depth, even the beauty of the means of formation towards those ends. It could mean that. But I think, you know, part of what I really admire Adler for doing is sort of this effort to democratize, which is horribly complicated. I mean, we won't even, of course, scratch the surface on this, but I think that point is really well made, Heather, that we understand what formation and all of its particulars, and when we get down to the specifics, it really, I think, brings this into view. I would say one of probably the student that was most impacted over all the years that I was at Covenant Classical in Fort Worth for 13 years was a student when we got to 8th grade who we decided didn't think had the capacity to finish out, and we weren't doing him a service. So I talked to his parents, and they cried and they agreed. They went and told him, and he, through an absolute conniption, demanded to come into my office where he threw a conniption in front of me. And we said, okay, against our better judgment, we're gonna do this. And when that kid graduated, I've never seen a kid more transformed, impacted, yeah, in every way. Went on to Texas A&M. No one in that entire community would have said he was capable of doing that. That's why I really don't like these ideas of interviewing students, you know, when they are about to go into middle school or they're about to go in high school, or whether they really want what we have to offer. They don't know what they want. If we're not forming their affections for these good things, then what are we doing? You know, are we just sort of sitting back and deciding, you know, someone's future affections and capacities by, you know, their 12-year-old disposition in a given moment? I think that's really a dangerous thing to do. So I think it's really well said. And given the fact that we have a very wide spectrum of how this will impact students, does complicate it. But it doesn't change that ultimate end that we're aiming for.
Now,
You know what?
how does that square, though, Eric, with what Jake said about there being some desire, that there being some docility? And this is what Andrew does to represent him in his essay. He says that there needs to be sufficient desire and sufficient ability to learn. So he's taking these two characteristics and he's saying if someone does not have sufficient ability, they might not qualify for your program. And I think this can vary vastly circumstantially, because if it's a graduate school program or a college program like Gary's, working with the honors program at HCU, that might be different than a kindergartner coming into Covenant Classical, and you're trying to assess docility and virtue or ability at that point. But this is what Andrew is saying anyway. He says desire and ability have to be considered when you bring someone into a classical education. Jake, how would you respond to what Eric said in light of what you previously said about a student having some desire to learn? Eric's story is pretty inspiring.
No, I actually don't see a contradiction there. So this is why I made the distinction between meeting a qualification for enrollment versus meeting a qualification for success, right? So in order for a student to be educated classically, there still does have to be a desire. It is absolutely 100% the job of the teachers and the school leaders to foster that desire in the students. This is precisely why I would not, put enrollment restrictions on that. I also don't like this idea of interviews. Of course, we run public charter schools. We're not doing interviews for any kind of enrollment like that. But I would not be in favor of that. So I don't actually see a contradiction there. I think I was just trying to make what I thought was kind of at least an obvious start to answering the question, like, what does it take in order to have the capacity to be classically educated? Like at some point, I think there does have to be a desire to receive it. That does not mean that the child has to have that desire at the beginning. That is our job to foster it, to train the palate of the child and really not just the child, but the family too, for these good and beautiful and noble things.
Thank you. Louis, you were going to say something, and then
Yeah,
Christine,
one
love to
thing
hear
I
from you.
one thing I wanted to add to the whole definitional thing. So we've got classical, we've got liberal arts, but of course we've also got the idea of paideia, not just education, but enculturation. We said it before. It is not just a part of paideia, it is actually our responsibility to pass down the tradition to the next generation. So even if they don't want it, it is really our responsibility to pass down those elements of the culture that have created our culture. That's why the great books, whatever, the great conversation is absolutely essential and at the center. That's why I don't understand why E.D. Hirsch never mentions Mortimer Adler's Paideia proposal in his books, but his idea of cultural literacy is absolutely essential. So the great books are a tool because they make the students think and reason and dialogue, but they are also the information that they need to allow for any kind of dialogue. And Hirsch is also very democratic in saying that whatever, the poor children will never enter into the dialogue if they don't at least know the major ideas that we've been wrestling with for all these years. So it's our responsibility to do what we can to get that into students, or they're going to be left out of the conversation that is our democracy.
So I'm interested in thinking about minimums and in thinking about obstacles, trying to make the conversation a little bit more concrete. I think we've done a great job with the philosophy and the sort of outer boundaries. So we've talked about desire. I think that's concrete. I'm interested in the notion of attention too, and the need to be able to attend as a prerequisite, and what is it that makes that possible, both, at home, chiefly at home, I guess I would say. And I think that's where I was introducing the idea of we have a new cultural problem in attention. And in some ways it has to do with wealth, not poverty. But I also think relevant to this conversation is John Senior's idea of good books, which is, what does it mean to prepare to read the great books? How do we, if this is the goal, how do we work backwards and where do we start? And I'm thinking about the ecclesial schools in Florida that Kevin Clark, writer of the liberal arts tradition, has begun. And these are some of the questions that those schools have asked. Kevin was at the Geneva School, thought a lot about maximums, and then went and started a program that was very focused on minimums and focused on good books as a kind of scaling up to something else. So I think that'd be an interesting part of the conversation to have, and maybe useful to people who are with us.
Yeah, if I could interject here, and I'll try to join this remark with what Christine just said. But I want to capitalize on Gary's remark earlier. Gary talked about the difference between entrance into a regime of education, broadly considered, versus admission into a particular cohort. Now, as classical educators, we are interested in those excellences that are distinctively human, that are proper to humanity. That's what a virtue is. It's an excellence that is proper to humans. And if we're interested in excellence, then somewhere in our community, broadly speaking, we should support a cohort. I hope it exists somewhere where they're conducting a reader seminar on Plato's Republic in Greek. And as a movement, if we have no room for that cohort to exist somewhere within our community, then I think our movement has failed. And so we need to have room within, as classical educators, for intellectual excellences to advance learning at the highest level, and to have cohorts where that's existing. Now, how do you get admitted into that cohort? Well, you need to know Attic Greek. Okay, that's a high bar of admission, but I want that cohort to exist. Now, I would hope that the members of that cohort, once they step out of the seminar, are going to be interacting with people maybe who have Down syndrome and another. While classical education can serve everybody, that doesn't mean that everybody should be in the exact same cohort. And I think we do need to create cohorts that are accessible across the range, and serve people across the range, but it should also serve and advance excellence as well. So we should
Chris,
talk about, in terms of admissions, we should talk about admission to a cohort rather than admission to educability.
I guess I want to push in a little bit on the idea of human excellence being that those individuals who are in that cohort. It is, maybe I misunderstood. Are those people achieving human excellence in a way that a child with Down syndrome cannot?
Yes. Intellectual excellence. They're reading Plato and Greek. Are they better people? No, but there are particular intellectual virtues that I think we want to celebrate. And we also know that knowledge puffs up and love, so that should be also attended with humility. The Down syndrome kid might be the thongs of whose sandals they are not worthy to loose. But we should foster excellence in learning, and there should be cohorts where that can take place. And if it's a healthy cohort, then those same people who are in the Plato seminar are going to find ways in their lives and in their communities to dignify the Down syndrome kid.
So
we have children with Down syndrome in our Humane Letters course of study, who are they're not in the Greek class. I will say that, but they are sitting and they're engaging in Plato's Republic in our 11th grade course.
And I think
my challenge just quickly is that I wrote a note. I'm not sure I know how much of that they're able to access. And for me to judge that, or the qualifications of that, that's a challenge I think that I have as I've been working with students over the years. Intellectual excellence for that individual is engaging in some way in the experience of that discussion. Is that child reading it? No. Is that child a part of the discussion? Yes.
Right. And I would further say that the presence of that student is actually a benefit to the others in the room as well. So it's not just whether the kid with Downs is being benefited, although that's part of it, but it also is the kid with Downs benefiting others. And I would say yes. So if the people in the Plato seminar that I'm imagining if their exclusive community contact is with the other Plato seminar people, then that's disordered. But there should be a cohort, a space where they can go to pursue that. And if it's pursued rightly, they will also seek out arenas where they're interacting with other people and not just their Plato cohort. And within a community, within a broader classical education community, we should have space for all of that to take place.
Now, in the old ways of talking about education, there's a metaphor that I'm sure most of you have heard about, which is simply the educational ladder. That everybody can get on a ladder, and maybe a better analogy would be a roadway, a pathway. You can get on the path. And if we consider classical education a path that we walk on that does lead to wisdom and virtue and skills, not everyone has to get off at the same place, but everyone should be welcome to walk. And there can be various places where there can be fruitful, flourishing communities or cohorts, like Chris talked about, that vary. And sometimes they're intermixed in interesting ways, because it's like now I'm changing the metaphor. It's like a garden. Things start to, there's a kind of interesting wild harmony sometimes in living things. So maybe this is a metaphor that can help us. And I'm going to make a transition now to the audience and their questions. Is that classical education is a hospitable tradition that welcomes people and gets people on a path, but based on our families, our backgrounds, our dispositions, our genetics, we are able to do different things. And difference doesn't mean always better or worse, but sometimes it does mean different kinds of excellences. And sometimes we might even use the word higher, like we do with higher education. Not everyone, we might say, can ascend to becoming a physicist. Like, I don't know that I could ever become a theoretical physicist. I'm not sure it's my brain it would be able to do. Okay, that's all right. I have other things that God's equipped me to do. So there's something hospitable about it, but there's also something that allows people to flourish and grow in different ways. I think that's discernible in everybody's paper, even Andrew's. But there seems to be some prerequisites that matter. So if a student comes to one of the Great Heart schools, or to that school in Fort Worth that Eric used to serve, coming to classical, and they come with something already. And while it's the duty of teachers to foster these things and help grow them, along with parents and pastors and others, we all know that it matters who that student is when they walk through the door. And then they become a part of the community. And so one of the questions is this, and I'm making the segue. What happens?
Chris, sorry.
Yeah, jump in.
Can I say something that I'm not sure, at least in my mind, it's not clear the sort of the connection between sort of higher or advanced education and sort of the ladder or the path metaphor. Because I think it turns out that reading Plato in Greek is relatively easy. You could get a student from no Greek to the Republic like in a year, right? If you were really just going flat out. If they had other considerations, it might take 2 or 3 years, but that's not that difficult. I mean, it strikes me like the hard part is what Plato says in the Republic is to contemplate the forms, right? To think about these abstract sort of things that give meaning to every facet of the universe in our lives, and are somehow connected with the physical objects of everyday life, but somehow totally separate from them. And that knowledge, he says, that's the goal. Right? It's not the PhD, which is the advancement, but it's the genuine knowledge and understanding of reality. I don't think anyone's denying that, but it struck me that there might be a little confusion about, well, what is it to go further along the path? I mean, it's not like, what do you do after you get your PhD? You go for another one, or you do a postdoc, or these sorts of things. So, but it also strikes me that just an aside, I don't think we know whether it's possible to teach ancient Greek to students who are intellectually challenged. And one reason for that is it certainly hasn't been, I don't think, in the history of education, something that has sort of been, hey, maybe we should really think about whether we can do this. I think it's been more or less assumed that it's not possible. maybe up until the last 100 years or so, and maybe there are pockets here and there where it's been tried that I don't know of. But it might be possible, and we're just not thinking about the right way to do it. It might also just take a really, really long time to do it, and we're just not, for good reasons or bad, willing to invest that time, right? It might take 8 years to get a certain type of student through Greek grammar. Is that worth it? I mean, that's a judgment call, right?
Well, and
yeah.
Greek grammar.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm really disagreeing with anyone there, or even that what I said makes sense, but it struck me that the real thing is knowledge and understanding, in the way that Plato described it. But one of the things I also said in my essay that's coming to mind is one of the reasons that Plato sets out this sort of pretty lengthy set of prerequisites for, he thinks a good student, a promising student, is because he has such this high and lofty goal of education. But what if you just think that the goal of education is to enable people to be good friends with one another and to have interesting hobbies? Then I think the prerequisites come way, way down, right? It seems like anyone can do that if they are a decent human being. And can we help them educate them in ways that promote this decency and virtue still? Yeah, I think we can. And then in that case, right, Plato's just, he is maybe an elitist with, well, this is the goal of education. It's knowledge of these universal abstract entities. I mean, surprising that a philosopher would come to that conclusion, right? Because the poets all come to different conclusions, and their conclusions are, well, it's poetry. That's the meaning of life.
Well,
Yeah.
our audience has to know that Gary is a philosopher who reads Greek. So, yeah, Greek came easy to you, Gary.
Hardly, yeah.
Chris, can I say something, Chris?
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's important because it's one thing to read, Plato in Greek, but again, if the ultimate aim is about the expression of wisdom and virtue, I mean, Adler does such a great job of this to complicate it even further, because one of the things that he wrote was about the difference between schooling and education, and which really had a profound impact on me, because he says what we're doing from kindergarten really through college is schooling. We're teaching kids how to learn, but to be educated can't happen without life experience. And he says, you can't have enough life experience, have enough suffering, and go through the realities of human existence until you're late in your 40s. But you really haven't suffered enough until you're well into your 50s. So the fruits of the education and the things that we're pouring in are over a lifetime. And so, yeah, we'd love to see people be able to pursue the highest capacities that their intellect can take them, that their particular strengths and abilities can be developed. But ultimately, those things are sort of lived out. The virtues are lived out in the realities of friendship and human experience. And the real fruit of those are over a full lifetime.
Thank you. There's some rich things there, and I'd love to go further, but let's go to our questions, and we already have 13 of them. Those of you watching, if you haven't read the essays, you can, and they're good. And you go to Classical Academic Press, and then under resources, I think you'll see a drop-down menu that says the disputed question, and there's 4 sets of essays because this is our 4th question. So you're welcome to read those. They're all there, and you can also leave comments. You can interact with each of the essays. But now going to the comments, there was one that I noted where someone asked this question: what would happen if someone came into a class who was not docile and did not have the desire to get a classical education with the fellow students in that class, and was actually disruptive and distracting and detracting from what was happening with the other students? Maybe this is a question of what do you do when you have a bad apple in the class who's not cooperating and making it worse for others. Can that happen? Does that happen? And what do you do about it? And what does it say about this question?
Chris, I was thinking, I mean, that's a good question. And that's what all schools have to deal with. I think, I don't think there's a firm answer one way or another. It's on an individual basis. But, my essay dealt with the story of the best Christmas pageant ever. And you have Imogene Herdman, who is definitely disruptive. The whole Herdmans were disruptive. And, it ended up good. I don't know if it would always be this case. If you have a continual, disruption over and over, I think at some point there are other decisions that have to make. But, the Herdmans made that pageant better. They were going to be excluded. Everyone wanted them excluded from that pageant because they were not, they were disruptive and they seemed to detract from what was going on. And but in the end, I think they made it better for everyone, when they kind of had the Pentecost moment of what was happening. And we've been talking about having that kind of influence in our class. I mean, that's life. We have to deal with difficult people, and we have to deal with distractions, and we have to deal with hard people. And I don't think it is always a disservice when we have to train our students, how to love difficult people in our classroom. That doesn't mean that has to happen all the time. And I think that there can be some situations where there is, you might have to call it, especially if you don't have parent support, in that situation. But it's not necessarily a bad thing for our children to learn how to live in community with people that are very different from them, or who, may need some extra help in areas and love.
Yeah.
I'd like to add a little bit if I can. I've had over 18 years at Great Hearts as a special education teacher and leader in special education. This question has come my way many, many times. And like Carrie, and I think like many of you guys, there's I guess I'm not an extremist. I don't say at all costs should we include every single child, no matter their disposition, no matter their ability to engage. But I mean, I typed into the chat one of the things that forms the heart of my answer, which is that this isn't something that's unique to classical liberal arts education, but something that is unique to classical liberal arts education. Has to do with the stories that our children read, the community that's formed in a classical school, the fact that we are just as interested in tending the hearts of our children as we are interested in tending their minds. For these students who come into our classrooms challenging, what I often argue is this is the place where they have the best chance to have their soul formed, to change their disposition towards the classroom, towards their peers. Again, not at the cost of everyone else always, right? Like there is there's judgment that needs to be made in every situation. But if we start from a place of, well, this child is disruptive and so they can't be here because they're destroying the learning environment for everyone else, that discounts their ability to become part of the community. And one of the reasons that I stay and continue to stay with classical education is because I do think that, if not here, where for these students. So that's what I'd add.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to. Yeah, did you want to? There's just a few more questions I want to get to, but if you've got a piece of advice on this question, speak now.
Well, I was just going to say, just for analytical help, I can imagine a ministry going into a prison in a room of pedophiles, and okay, you can have a teacher who delivers a classical education to a cohort of convicted felons. Okay, these are individuals we would not want to mainstream into our schools, and yet could they benefit from a classical education? I think so, to summon them, to bring out their humanity, to right some things that are wrong and misdirected and disordered in their lives. I think that would be a wonderful ministry. And we have places like that in society where we relegate our convicted felons. I think they can benefit from a classical education. That doesn't mean they need to be in the same cohort as some of the other people who are also receiving a classical education, right? And it's fine to have different cohorts with different admissions requirements. And then each cohort is going to have its opportunities and its limitations and its challenges. But there we have it.
Chris, can I ask you a question? Because this is, I think, the second time you've mentioned cohorts. I specifically, well, in a particular way, pushed back on cohorts, at least within a school in my essay. At what age do you think admissions requirements for a cohort are appropriate?
It would be with moving into high school level, and oftentimes you can have a cohort within a certain class. Like, okay, this is going to be the advanced Latin class, and we are not going to admit students who have had no Latin into the advanced Latin class. Now, once again, if that advanced Latin class becomes the exclusive diet of the only human interaction that those students have, then that's a badly designed cohort. They should have social spaces even within the school where they're interacting with people that are at a different level than they are. But I bet you do it at Great Hearts. Do you admit 6-year-olds to 10th grade?
No,
So which means you have, within the span of Great Hearts, you actually following the very thing that I'm describing.
Sure, yeah. I mean, you have age level cohorts in terms of grade levels moving through.
Right.
Yeah, I was just curious where you would put that. So, for example, you would not say that we should have admissions requirements to cohorts for kindergarten.
Right. Do you cut students who try out for basketball?
Yes,
Why?
but sport.
Why do you do that?
Because so first of all, at our schools, we have competitive athletic opportunities for any student that wants to play. But do we cut from certain teams and do we have those cohorts? Yes, and my argument there is that athletics, by their very nature, are competitive, whereas education is not.
Okay, so you don't see levels of sophistication in a particular academic arena that should.
Yeah, I mean, what I laid out in my essay was that there are really good reasons not to do. And again, I don't want to. We're probably equivocating to some degree on what cohort means, right? Does cohort mean cohort within a school? Is a school itself a cohort? What about the cohort of third graders that are going through together? That's different than fourth graders. We certainly have age requirements, even on admissions into kindergarten. So we probably run the risk of equivocating here.
I suspect that that's probably true. What we're getting.
Yeah,
at.
I think what I was laying out very particularly was an argument against something like math tracking or even Latin tracking. But I would say again, just to clarify, what I mean and what I don't mean. Certainly, we don't ever want to take a student. Like, for example, our schools, we start formal Latin instruction in the 6th grade. We certainly wouldn't want to take an 8th grader who's new to our schools and has never had any Latin instruction and say, you're going to be in 8th grade Latin after having none of it, right? So there are exceptions to this, but generally, within a grade level, we try very hard not to track anything and to keep them as a community of learners making their way through the program.
Yeah. I think that, well, I think that there are benefits to having some tracking, and it needs to have limitations and barriers so that, because knowledge puffs up. I mean, I think it's healthy for 12th graders to interact with kindergartners and to have a school environment where there is some contact time where they see themselves as part of the same community, which is really great for those 12th graders, right? So are they part of the same cohort? That comes back to our definition. But I also think that there's room for the varsity basketball team, or for the Latin analogy to the varsity basketball team.
Well,
Something I wonder, and maybe this is a topic for a different disputed question, but it seems to me that in a classical or liberal arts spirit, that education is competitive in the same way that athletics are competitive. In that in education, I'm competing, as it were, against my own ignorance. And in athletics, I'm competing against a standard of excellence. And the opposing team is not my opponent, but they are actually a kind of a cooperation in which we mutually challenge each other to excel. One of us is going to lose the game, but the game itself is neither here nor there. The standard of excellence is what matters. And I think the same goes for education, right? The other students in my class are not competitors with me. I'm competing against my ignorance. But that, you know, someone might get a higher score than me. But that again, that's like I lost the game. That doesn't really matter. Did I play my best is what matters. Did I try to learn my best? That's what matters.
Well, but in a skill-based course like Latin grammar, I'm going to agree with you that there's a standard of excellence we want to seek. But when we're seeking that with other people, it's possible that we can all reach the same thing.
Yes.
Just
Just like in a game, in a basketball game, for example, someone will lose the game, but everyone can win. And I don't mean that to like everybody gets a prize. I mean everybody competed to the
there's some
highest
sports
level
like
possible.
golf where you can actually end up with the same score and end with the same score. But I also think that students spur one another on.
Yes.
And even the Down syndrome student can be an inspiration and a spur to other students who don't have Down syndrome, because there's other virtues at play besides just, say, the discussion at hand when they're in a literature seminar, because it's complex, multiple things happening at once. But you do have to get to a certain skill level to keep going. And so it does matter that we're moving a group. Heather mentioned that sometimes there's classes of 30 students and a teacher has to work to ensure some level of competency to keep that particular cohort moving through the school for several years. But let's call a timeout on that, because Ohio State's playing Notre Dame. And there's an Ohio State fan on the call. We have 10 minutes left, and I want to just get another couple of questions up. And who do you think the Ohio State fan is on this panel? Just look at the faces of people and you might know. Okay, in the chat box, who do you think the rabid Ohio State fan is? Who's on this call? Okay. Jay McClymont knew. Somehow.
As you guys know, he's been wearing a jersey all
That's
day.
Jake.
I'd
Jake's
like
been wearing a
to note
jersey
that
all
I
day.
did take the
Proud of it.
jersey off for this phone call.
I don't know, but as a Michigan fan, I was hoping they could both lose.
Oh, I want to revise my answer, Chris. I don't think classical education is for Michigan fans.
That's true.
There are exceptions. We might as well start making them now. So this question comes from Faith Martson. She says, how should a school handle grade promotion when a child is going to struggle significantly at the next level? How do you convince parents that a child will benefit from an extra year or two?
I think part of that is tied down to the support the child's been receiving through the time in the year. I think that that's a part of it. Students who have been receiving some sort of academic support that's been clearly defined for parents, and the parents have been invited in to understand what's being provided. Oftentimes, those conversations are a little bit easier. I'm not saying they are simple, but they are a little bit easier. Also helping the parent understand where their child is. Sometimes you'll get children in who are a bit young for the grade level, and parents might see the developmental maturity differences between some of the other children in the class and that child. So some of it depends on, actually, I believe all of it depends on the relationships that are being built with the families, the window into what you've been providing, the window into what they've been providing. Have they been supporting on their side? And that open dialogue often leads to a more positive outcome.
It sounds, I think we probably all agree that there are times when things, you have to make decisions like this. And it takes a great deal of prudence, knowing the families, knowing the students to make those decisions. But sometimes hard decisions have to be made when you're working with human beings. Here's another question. This is from an anonymous attendee. As an elementary middle school teacher, I confess that I've had my doubts about the universality of our mission. If a student thrives in a non-school environment but cannot sit still in a classroom, I have trouble saying that the schooling we offer is the best thing for them. I assume, a classical education at this school. I've even wondered whether free play in the great outdoors, along with learning some practical skills, such as how to tend a garden or care for animals or to build things, is an equally good training ground for the virtues as schooling in the liberal arts. Please prove me wrong. So here's a student who, like around here, we live close to Lancaster, where students stop after 8th grade and work on the farm. Or you hear about some students who, they know they want to be a carpenter when they're 14, and they really want to, or they want to do other things besides maybe move through all the way through college, say. Any other responses?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that they're mutually exclusive. There's a classical school called Sundial Classical Farmstead that's run by a friend named Sarah Belinsky. And it describes something very similar to what that anonymous person chimed in with. And Sarah, I mean, they still read great books and engage academic subjects. It's not the entirety of the education. I think it just describes the breadth of what's possible in classical education, that all schools don't have to look exactly the same. That there's a curriculum that matters, there's a pedagogy that matters, but that there's a lot of freedom within that. So yeah, I think maybe the confusion the person is having is saying that this classroom is not the best for that student, but that doesn't mean that classical education is not a benefit to that student. This version of classical education.
Yeah, I appreciate your comment about schools varying, and sometimes a school can grow and become, well, maybe these students need more free playtime at their school. Maybe there's a little bit of disharmony or discordance in the curriculum and setup of this school. Maybe I remember when I was head of school years ago, at one point we decided that our K-3 kids needed 3 recesses a day. And they needed a 15-minute in the morning, a 15-minute in the afternoon, and 20 minutes before or after lunch. And that just seemed to work. These kids needed to be outside having more free play. So that could be an issue too. Just even within the school, there could be some changes made.
Yeah, in my in my essay, the distinction I was trying to draw between sushi on the one hand and a good meal on the other, I think gets at this. Is a good meal for everyone? Yes. Is sushi a form of a good meal? Yes, but is it the only form of a good meal? No. In fact, sushi is not necessarily a good meal for everyone. And so this outside time, unstructured time for this one student can be a good education for that one student, and probably others as well. But it's not necessarily the best education for every student. But is a good education, a good classical education for everyone? Yes. But it needs to be tailored.
Yeah, I think we also need to look at, the difference between what classical education is and then an institution. So a school is an institution, and an institution kind of it's about perpetuating, itself, as a board member of a classical school, it's kind of my job to make sure the institution kind of survives. And I hope, I want our classical education, what we give these students, to also continue. But we may have to separate a little bit of, what's actually happening in education versus, what an institution does. As a homeschool parent, it looks very different than what an institution does. I have so much more flexibility to be able to meet my own children where they are and to help them flourish where they are. And so in that, I wish it included more things like raising, puppies or chickens or whatever. But I certainly had, more flexibility than them being sitting still in an institution for 6 hours a day, which was one of the reasons why I ended up homeschooling and taking my kids out of a classical school, is that's what my kids needed. So,
Yeah, I would say I would agree with that and say that there's a lot of good things that kids could do out there that are good for them. But school is not the place for all those things.
all right.
School is an academic institution. That's what it's gifted to do. That's its purpose. And there may be a bunch of other really great things, but they're not best done in school. And I think this is the problem that a lot of public schools have, is that they try to be everything to everybody, with social services and all these other things, and they get away from the main thing a school is supposed to do. And I don't think it would be a good idea for private schools.
Thank you,
Classical
everyone.
schools do the same thing.
Thank you, Martin, and everyone. Let's just conclude with you. We'll go around the horn. Please share one book title that you've read that is pertinent to this question that you would recommend folks reading. And if you would also just put it in the chat box, that will be helpful. But we'll start with Eric, and we'll go Eric, Carrie, Chris. I'll just call on you. But let's give us a book title that might be helpful about your views on this question. Eric.
Yeah, John Senior and the Restoration of Realism is fantastic. So it just talks about John Senior's approach to classical education, which required active engagement with gazing at the stars and going on walks and cultivating the senses and dancing and all the things that kept their the abstract ideas rooted in something real.
Thank you, Eric. How about you, Carrie? Oh, you're muted. Yeah, there you go.
On that note, I would say Poetic Knowledge by James Taylor, Recovery of Education. Again, that was very formative for me as an educator, and just reminding us, like you said, Eric, just grounding us in what is real and experiencing what is real.
Thank you. Chris, how about you?
Green Eggs and Ham, read with 2-year-olds. It's good for your soul. And it actually, the experience touches a lot of the issues here.
Thank you. Tom.
For me, it's called Disability in Classical Education. It's a really new book. It's not a classic by any stretch, but it's rooted in classical education, and I think it's just a really beautiful vision of, of what's possible.
Thank you, Tom. Gary.
I put the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. It's a challenging book in terms of who do you think is capable of receiving the highest form of education? I don't think many people at the time would have thought, well, Frederick Douglass, this boy, he's who we should really educate. And turns out, no, he was the one. Yeah.
Thank you. Martin.
I would say Paideia, The Ideals of Greek Culture by Werner Jaeger. That's my favorite book on this topic.
Thank you, Martin. Jake.
Yeah, let me just go a little bit different direction. I mean, it'd be pretty easy to mention anything by Mortimer Adler. Let me go an entirely different direction and say I think it's worth reading Mindset by Carol Dweck, which really kind of details, in my opinion, just a very good argument against something like math tracking.
Thank you. Heather.
Souls of Black Folk by Du Bois, especially chapter 5. He gives a beautiful explanation of why classical education is for the freedman's son and for all of us.
Thank you. Christine.
Only the Lover Sings by Joseph Pieper, and Teacher, the One Who Made a Difference by Mark Edmondson.
Excellent. And I'll suggest a collection of essays by Jacques Barzun, who kind of takes the other view, but he does it intelligently, and you'll appreciate what he says. Begin Here. And it's a collection of maybe 15 or 20 essays that he's written over the years. Well, that concludes our time. Thank you.